Hello, and welcome to another Theology Thursday. The New Testament obviously quotes from the Old Testament dozens and dozens of times, and then there are like allusions or references, maybe just a couple words here or there, some reference to something in the Old Testament without actually quoting it. So Jesus will make reference to a story about David and some things like that. So we have lots and lots and lots of those. So when we're all said and done, there are hundreds of Old Testament quotes, allusions, or references in the New Testament. Of all of those, the longest quoted Old Testament passage is Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. It's a very, very, very important passage. As a matter of fact, Jeremiah is, technically speaking, the longest of all of the prophetic books by a few words, but it is actually the longest of all of them. And Jeremiah is the first person that the apostles identified Jesus as being like. Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And some said Jeremiah. And so it was their first reference. So Jeremiah is my favorite book in the Old Testament. And of all the quotes and references to Jeremiah in the New Testament, there are more from these verses in Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, than all the rest of the references to Jeremiah combined. That's how important it is in both the Old and New Testaments. So let me just read for us these verses, and we'll talk about them for a little bit. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor, and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Now, this entire passage is quoted in full in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 12. And so it is the longest Old Testament quote in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, us using the words Old Testament and New Testament have to do with covenant is the English word and testament is the Latin word. And so Old Testamentum, Old Testament, is the Old Covenant. And New Testament is the New Covenant. So the fact that your Bible is divided into two main sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament, is because of these verses right here. These verses divide between the Old and New Covenant. It's also interesting that this is the only place in the entire Old Covenant, the Old Testament, that the words New Testament are found. The only place that we have any reference to the New Covenant in the Old Covenant or inside the Old Testament. So there's some interesting things that we see when we go through this. I thought it might be easier just to show you. So there are several things that are both similar between the Old and New Covenants, but there's some things that are different. So in the Old Testament, all these are references here to Jeremiah, God's power remains the same. God's the one who's going to make the covenant. God's people, both covenants are cut with the nation of Israel. The reason we use the word cut is because in the Old Testament, they use the word cut, not make, because they would cut the animals and walk between them. And so it was a picture of their ceremony. Both have laws. Both provide forgiveness. Exodus 34 talks about forgiveness under the Old Covenant. Both are permanent. The references to the Old Covenant, like in the Ten Commandments, they don't change. They are eternal. But there are some things about the New Covenant that are superior. We will be renewed. It will not be external, but it will be internal. God's Spirit's inside of us, and so the motivation is no longer commands from the outside, but from Spirit dwelling in us. Obedience is based on God's strength, not ours. There's restoration. The redemption from Egypt is going to be replaced. And so as you look at this new covenant, God's not just tossing out the Old Testament. He's saying, look, the Old Testament was fine, but incomplete. There's something better coming. There's a conclusion, a completion. And of course, that's found in Jesus. And so every covenant needs people that are a part of that covenant. And Jesus is the one who is the sacrificial animal, the one who cuts, who makes the covenant between us and God in the new covenant. And so he is the fulfillment of this, and that's what the Bible's talking about in Hebrews chapter 8, where it quotes this this passage in its fullness and in its entirety. So just a couple things that I do want to note, though, specifically from the passage that are really, 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 I think, the most significant. One is that when Jeremiah uses the phrase, "Behold, the days are coming," oftentimes it's a message of hope in his book. And so, matter of fact, he uses the phrase more than all the rest of the Old Testament combined. So speaking about a day in the future, which we now know to be, of course, what Jesus has done. And so, the Old Covenant is clearly spelled out in verse 32. It's not a reference to like God's covenant with Adam, or it's specifically to the covenant with Moses. It's found in Exodus chapters 19 and 20, because he says, "Not like the covenant that I cut with their fathers when I took them to bring them out of the land of Egypt." Well, God brought them out of the land of Egypt. He brought them to Mount Sinai, and in chapter 19, the covenant is instigated, implemented, and then in Exodus 20, we find the regulations for that being the Ten Commandments that are found there. So God says it's not going to be like that. But notice God doesn't jettison the law. He says the difference is my law is going to be put within them, and I'm going to write it on their hearts. And so it's going to flow out of us. I'll be their God, and they will be my people. This is two parts of the three-part covenant promise. I'll be your God, you'll be my people, and I will dwell with you. And so we rarely find all three of them together. But here we find two of them, like we do often. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. And that's really cool. He says no one will need to teach their neighbor because they will all know me. This is a reference to the fact that the day is coming, ultimately in heaven, where we find the completion of the new covenant, where there will be no instruction. There'll be no teaching. There'll be no preaching, because everyone, from the least to the greatest, and this would be like from the youngest to the oldest, will know him. But I love this statement here, "For I will forgive their iniquity, and I'll remember their sin no more." The real key to the new covenant, the real key is forgiveness. You and I can only get into the new covenant through the forgiveness that comes through Jesus Christ. And the idea here is that something that only God can do. Only God can forgive iniquity. And all these words are full of all kinds of meaning, and I've discussed them on other Theology Thursdays in the past, so we won't go through all that again today. But I do want to just talk about this, remember their sin no more. God cannot forget anything. God remembers our sin in the sense of that God knows that it happened. But in the Bible, remember and forget are action words. And so when God says, "I will remember their sin no more," what he's saying is, I will not hold it against them anymore. I will not take action against them anymore for their sin. And so it's a good thing to know that God is not going to remember against me my sins anymore. The action against my sins has been taken care of by Jesus on the cross. So instead of the action being taken against me, the action is taken against Jesus in my place as my substitute, so that now I can be in covenant with God, His Spirit dwelling within me, His law written on my heart, so that I might live out what it means to be in the new covenant. So the last thing I want to focus on is just talk about this word covenant. The word covenant it can be a business term. It can mean like just a contract. It can also be like a treaty between nations. Nations would enter into covenant with one another. It would be a treaty. But most of the time, covenant is between individuals. And it's legal, but it's also personal. So for example, you would have a covenant with your neighbor about the creek that runs through your property and his, and about how much water each of you will take out of the creek, especially if it's like the boundary between your properties. Or maybe you want to share a field with your neighbor because it's better for both of you, and so you draw up a covenant. So yes, it's a legal contract, but you're not just business people, you're also neighbors, you're friends. So covenant carries a personal aspect with it as well. You might make a commitment to someone personally. I mean, the ultimate personal commitment we make is marriage. Marriage is viewed as a covenant, and obviously there's some legal issues there regarding marriage, but it's also very, very personal. Matter of fact, I would argue it's personal before it is legal. And so the idea of covenant is that we are in a legal relationship with God because there's something that we had to pay for. That was our sin. We didn't pay for it. Jesus paid for it in our place, but it's been paid for. There is a legal element to it, that we are legally allowed into heaven because we're in covenant with God, because the contract has been satisfied by the death of Jesus. But we don't want to spend forever in heaven celebrating a business contract, a legal document. That doesn't sound like worship. It sounds like torture. So even though there is a legal element to it, to what Jesus has done for us and satisfying the justice of God, the idea of us being in covenant with God is that it's personal, that we're in a personal relationship with God, a personal covenant with Him, that we're a part of His family. We're described as the bride of Christ, the church is. We're described as the daughters and sons of God. We're the children of God. We're a part of the family of God. And so the idea is that we are in this very close, personal, intimate covenant relationship with God. And so, the cool thing is that this new covenant guarantees an eternal relationship that we have with Him through Jesus. So I just want to touch on this because it is, as I said, the longest quoted passage in the New Testament from the Old Testament. And to hope encourage you today that, as you go through this day and every day going forward, the rest of this week and month and year and all of that, to remember that if you belong to Jesus, you are a part of the new covenant, that you're in a covenant relationship with God, a personal relationship with God, and the legal requirements for that relationship have been satisfied, have been fulfilled by Jesus Christ. So God bless you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.